Yeah, what's up? Pascal here. Nice to see you again on my channel. And today we'll talk about the 180-degree rule and ND filters and if they are really that important, because I actually get this question asked a lot. So, should you get ND filters, and is the 180-degree rule actually that important, like everyone says? I actually get these questions asked a lot, and the reason for that, I would say, is actually that there are a lot of YouTube videos out there that suggest buying ND filters because you want to get this cinematic look. And of course, these videos are particularly right because there is a big rule, the 180-degree rule in filmmaking, that says that your shutter speed should always be twice the frame rate. And I personally don't agree 100% with it because it depends a bit on the situation, on your shot and so on, what you want to do, and it's also a creative aspect. So in this video I really want to give you all the information that you need to base your decision if you need ND filters and also if you want to stick to the 180-degree rule or not. So this video could take a bit longer, but keep watching, it's definitely worth it. And the first point I want to talk about here, and yeah, just to make it sure from the beginning that we're on the same level, is why ND filters are actually used. So there is this rule, 180-degree rule, and this rule means that your shutter speed should be twice your frame rate. And ND filters help with that, because simply when you want to make a shutter speed twice the frame rate and you can't adjust your aperture, or you want to use a low aperture for getting a nice blurry background, like here for example, like right now, then you have to make sure that your image gets darker, because otherwise it will be way too bright, right? If I wouldn't lower my shutter speed right now, because right now I don't use an ND filter, I will tell you later why. And yeah, then like I would be completely white and the background would be white, you wouldn't see anything, right? So this is actually where ND filters come into play. It just makes the image darker so that you can lower your shutter speed, because a lower shutter speed always means that your image gets brighter, and the higher shutter speed means that your image gets darker. So now that we know why people use ND filters and we also know a bit more about the 180-degree rule, let's talk about when you should actually stick to the 180-degree rule and what it actually does. So the 180-degree rule is there to give your moving object, or yeah, like everything that's moving in your shot, a certain amount of motion blur, and that is the motion blur that looks natural to the eye. So when you have your shutter speed twice your frame rate, then you get a motion blur that looks around as the motion blur that we see when, for example, a car is driving by. You can see that in the shots that I show here right now. So right now I'm showing a shot where I don't stick to the 180-degree rule. You see it's a very high shutter speed. You see a bit of ghosting. It looks like a bit stuttery. Just doesn't look that nice. And now the shot that I show you, there you can see motion blur. I stick to the 180-degree rule there and it looks great, right? You can see it looks a lot smoother. So but now is the question, when should you use this 180-degree rule? When is it actually important? Because always sticking to the 180-degree rule can be quite hard sometimes, especially if you're at the beginning, you don't have a high budget and you probably don't have ND filters then, and it can be quite hard to always stick to it. For example, when you have the DJI Osmo Pocket, you cannot adjust your aperture there, and then the only way to adjust your exposure is the shutter speed, and that means that when you don't have ND filters, you just can't stick to the 180-degree rule. It's in a lot of cases not possible, maybe in low light, but not on sunny, bright days. That's what I wanted to say. So when do you need to stick to it? And the most important things where you really have to stick to the 180-degree rule to get the best results is when you have moving objects or your camera is moving. Because when you have movement in the shot, you want to get motion blur. Like if nothing in the shot is really moving, then it's not that important. Or if you, let's say you have only a little bit of movement in the shot, then it's always not that important. You can actually see that right now, because I'm not using the 180-degree rule right now. First reason is I use a wide aperture and I don't have an ND filter for that lens right now. And for me right now, it's important that this background is nice, blurry, and that I'm in focus, and this lens does it perfectly. But I don't have an ND filter, so right now I don't stick to it. And the reason why this is not so important right now is because I'm not moving that much. I move my hands a bit, so you can actually see that right now that I have a too high shutter speed. There's no motion blur. But Like generally, well, I'm speaking, only part that really moves is my lips and my head moves a little bit, but you won't notice a big difference in motion blur when I use the 180-degree rule. So right now it's actually not that important. And I forgot that here, another case where you want to use ND filters or stick to the 180-degree rule is definitely when you do panning shots, because when you pan your camera you can also perceive motion blur a lot. So especially at the edges, if you film in 24p and you have a high shutter speed, you can see some jittery footage there. It really doesn't look nice. So if you do a lot of panning and so on, especially fast pans, then it's definitely better to stick to that. Yeah, and the other thing where it gets even more important to use the 180-degree rule is when the object that is moving is close to your camera. Because when an object is close, the movement is always a bit faster and you can actually see the motion blur more. I can blend in here a shot from some cliffs that I filmed, and there you can see some seagulls flying around. And in this clip I stick to the 180-degree rules, but the seagulls are very far away, so you can barely notice it, right? So if you really watch close to it, if you really think about that, then you probably see that there's motion blur while they are flying, but it doesn't do that much. You wouldn't notice that if I wouldn't use the 180-degree rules there, if I wouldn't have ND filters on the camera or on the drone in that case. So when the object is actually very far away and it's not that obvious in the shot, like in this shot obviously your attention is more at the big mountains there, then it's actually not that important to use the 180-degree rule. And that's what we're actually coming to right now in the next step, when the 180-degree rule is not that important. That are actually a lot of cases. But when is it not that important to stick to the 180-degree rule? There are actually a lot of cases, and the first case, obviously, like mentioned before, is when there's not much movement in the shot, like right now, like in interviews, it's not that important. And another case that is usually mentioned in videos like that is sports and action shots. For example, when you watch movies like Matrix, then you can see it a lot that they actually don't stick to the 180-degree rule, that there's actually not much motion blur in there. And this is actually an artistic element, because in that case, they want to show a bit of chaos, and because of the fast movements, they want you to still see some details in the shot and so on. That would be quite hard if there's a lot of motion blur. So that were the first three cases where the 180-degree rule is not that important. So sports and action shots, then when your object is very far away that's moving, or when there's not much movement in your shot at all. But there's actually another case, because those three cases are all regarding raising your shutter speed. But you could also lower your shutter speed under the 180-degree rule, or even under your frame rate, which makes your footage stuttery if you do a normal video. But there are actually cases when you want to use that. For example, if the stutteriness is actually cool because it gives it a nice effect and you want to have a lot of motion blur in your shot, but also in hyperlapses. And when you follow my channel for a while, you know that I like to shoot hyperlapses, or let's say time lapses. Time lapses is even the better example here. And that is because when you have a time lapse and let's say cars are driving by or people are walking by, and you use a high shutter speed, and those cars and people are like totally sharp, and that looks pretty weird. It doesn't come natural in the time lapse or hyperlapse. So a good shutter speed that is usually used in time lapse is somewhere around 1/15 of a second. And because when you use that shutter speed, which is actually quite low already, then you have a decent amount of motion blur, a little bit more motion blur than you would naturally have when you stick to the 180-degree rule. But because it's a time lapse and the shot is sped up, it actually makes the time lapse or the hyperlapse look a lot smoother. So in that case, when you shoot time lapses or hyperlapses, it's actually okay to don't act to the 180-degree rule and lower your shutter speed. And just to mention that here, don't always do that, especially when you shoot hyperlapses. Like in time lapses, you can always do that, and you should. But in hyperlapses, especially when you do those hyperlapses where you don't have a tripod at all or anything like that, where you just hold your camera, then I would suggest to actually raise your shutter speed as high as possible, because when you shake a little bit, then you will get some like weird stuff in your picture, like everything gets blurry, and that doesn't look nice. So on time lapses, always use a low shutter speed, but when you do hyperlapses, it's usually better to use a high shutter speed, especially when you only shoot with your bare hands. If you have a tripod or anything like that, then it's totally fine. So now we already learned a lot about the 180-degree rule and when to use it and when not, or when it's not that important. But there's actually one more thing that I want to mention here, and that is actually very important to get a better understanding of the 180-degree rule, and that is why the 180-degree rule is in a lot of cases actually wrong. The reason for that is simply that the 180-degree rule only says that you get a natural motion blur when you set your shutter speed twice your frame rate, right? And that is wrong, because the only thing that actually affects your motion blur is the shutter speed. Your frame rate doesn't affect the motion blur. So let me give you some examples to make that a bit clearer. Let's say you have a clip that you shoot in 25p. I use 25p right now. I usually shoot in 24p, but I use 25p right now to make it a bit easier to see everything. So you shoot in 25p, you want to publish in 25p, so you set your shutter speed to 50. That's totally correct, and this rule applies completely. But now let's say you set your frame rate to 50 FPS and your shutter speed to 100, and you want to publish the video in 50 FPS. Then your motion blur would actually be only half as much as if you would shoot with a 50 shutter, right? So your video would look more fluid now because you publish in 50p, but you would have less motion blur, what makes your shot look less natural. So in that case, it's actually wrong to use that rule. In that case, like if you really want to publish it like that, what I would never do, because 50p doesn't really make sense as long as you don't do, like you film football or whatever, you want to show some sports, then it actually makes sense to use high frame rates and to publish in high frame rates. But what you usually would do if you want to publish in such a frame rate, then you would still set your shutter speed to 50, even if you shoot at a 50 frame rate. I mean, don't do that, because in normal shots, when it's not sports, you don't want to publish in 50p like mentioned before. And if you have, let's say if you film sports, then it's actually better to have a bit less motion blur so that you can see the ball flying better and so on. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't want to say anything here that makes your videos bad, so really listen closely to that. But now let's also go through another case here, and that is that you want to publish in 25p, you shoot in 50p and with a shutter of 100, and you want to slow down that shot later to 50%, so that you have a 50% slow motion. And in that case, it's totally correct to use a shutter of 100 or sometimes even higher, depending on how you want it to look, because when you have slow motion, you actually want to show the movement. You want the people to see more details in the shot, right? And when you have slow motion, it's better to have less motion blur for that reason. Pretty simple. And actually, like, to make that a bit more, like to explain that a bit better so that you can understand it good, is imagine a car is driving by. You have the natural motion blur that your eyes see when you see the car driving by. But now you film it in twice the frame rate that you would usually do. So you would normally shoot in 25p, but because you want to slow that clip down later, you shoot in 50p. And what it basically makes, it slows the movement of the car down to 50%. So realistically, this car would drive like just half the speed. And then of course you would only see half the motion blur with your normal eyes, right? In that case, it's actually correct to use 100 shutter. So I think this should be a good explanation here with the car. And what I also want to mention here, after we talked about that, is that because of that, it's not that important to use the 180-degree rule when you shoot slow motion. I purposefully didn't mention that before because I first want to give you that explanation. And it's actually why you don't see in my videos the 180-degree rule a lot, because a lot of my clips I actually film them in 60p. I slow them down to 24p, like to 40%, and then it's a slow motion. So in this slow motion, I want to show details, like you should see this subject, and I don't want to have everything blurry, right? So in that case, it's actually okay to use an even higher shutter. Even, like, of course, the perfect look would be if I would constantly shoot at a shutter speed of 120, or realistically on a GH5 125. But because I don't have an ND filter and so on, I usually don't do that, and no one ever complains about that in my videos, simply because it's not that obvious. It's slow motion, right? So when you shoot in slow motion, when you want to do that, then just the 180-degree rule is really not that important, and You can get ND filters if you want to shoot like that, to stick to a shutter speed of 120, 125, but you don't have to. Like, it would not be my first bought accessoire. I would rather invest in a gimbal or maybe in better lighting or whatever you want to shoot, or better audio, but ND filters would definitely come last in that case. So let's come to a conclusion here. As you can see, the 180-degree rule is really not that important, not as important as a lot of people tell you, especially not when you're starting out and you just want to have like your first travel videos on YouTube and so on. In that case, instead of investing in ND filters, I would rather invest the money in some other gear, or I would do some more activities in the country that you want to travel, because that will add more to your video finally. But where the 180-degree rule becomes a lot more important over time is when you get more into professional work and you get high-paying clients and so on. Then of course they want to have the perfect image quality, perfect like smooth video. And in that case, you should do your very best to stick to that rule. And if you have clients that pay you like thousands of dollars or so on for a video, then you also have the budget to invest into ND filters, and to learn how to use them actually goes quite quick. So you can do that later as well. And yeah, just don't get crazy about ND filters and just enjoy shooting, especially at the beginning, because when you just get your first camera and you're starting out, you go on a trip and you film everything and you put it together in Final Cut or Premiere or whatever, it just makes so much fun. Like, enjoy that and don't get crazy about ND filters, really. So take it with a grain of salt, of course. Some people might not agree with me, because, well, it's still a common rule in filmmaking, I understand that. But yeah, I really think that as a beginner, it's not that important. So yeah, I hope you liked that video, and I was able to help you at first to make a decision of buying ND filters, but also about like helping you to make a decision if you stick to the 180-degree rule or not, and when to actually use it. So if you liked that video, then please hit the subscribe button now and the like button, because I publish one video per week, so you can actually learn a lot more in the future. See ya.